A child is born in Samarkand. His eyes light, almost gray, stare into a world of sun-drenched steppe and ancient domes. His skin carries the tone of desert light. His cheekbones mirror a distant Mongol past. But his blood is older than memory. Who was this child's first ancestor? Was it a Scythian warrior galloping across the Iranian plateau? A merchant from the Caucasus resting beside a caravanserai? Or a horseman who once rode beneath the banner of Genghis Khan? To find the answer, we must go beyond flags and borders. We must journey into the invisible record, the story etched in chromosomes and haplogroups, passed through centuries of conquest, trade, and love. This is the genetic odyssey of the Uzbeks, and it is unlike any other. If you type Uzbek into a DNA database, you won't get a single match. You'll get a mosaic. Geneticists have puzzled over this for years, because Uzbeks don't fit the mold. They are a Turkic-speaking people, yes, but genetically, they straddle two worlds. One foot in the west, one in the east. One ancestor milking goats in the Iranian highlands, another hunting elk on the Siberian taiga. How did this come to be? Long before the word Uzbek existed, there were the Sogdians, the Bactrians, the Khwarezmians, Iranian-speaking peoples who settled the oases and river valleys of what is now Uzbekistan. They built cities, Bokhara, Samarkand, and traded silk and jade while the Roman Republic was still rising. Their skeletons, unearthed in dry earth and ancient crypts, speak with surprising clarity. DNA extracted from their bones reveals something profound. These Iron Age peoples were West Eurasian, not Turkic, not Mongol. Their Y-DNA, haplogroups like R1A1 and J2, trace back to the Indo-European steppe migrations and ancient Mesopotamia. Modern Uzbeks still carry this exact genetic signal. Up to 65% of Uzbek ancestry can be modeled as Indo-Iranian. Not just language or culture, but genes, preserved through millennia of upheaval. This is the foundation of Uzbek DNA. But it is only the beginning. In the 6th century, the skies over Central Asia darkened with dust and hoofbeats. The Turkic tribes had arrived. From the Altai Mountains they came, Karluks, Yamas, Gökturks. They didn't build cities. They rode with the wind. They brought a new language, new customs, and new genes. Yet they didn't erase what came before. Unlike many conquerors, the Turkic nomads absorbed as much as they imposed. The Iranian-speaking populations of the oasis towns didn't disappear. They became Uzbeks. Turkic language took root, but the people remained genetically hybrid. The gene pool deepened, not replaced. Uzbek DNA began to shift. Eastern lineages appeared, C2, Q, and even O, haplogroups tied to Siberia, to the East Asian heartland. But they joined the older Iranian branches, not in conquest, but in fusion. A second ancestry was now layered atop the first, and the balance had begun. Then came the storm. The 13th century saw the fury of Genghis Khan wash across the steppe like wildfire. Samarkand fell. Bokhara fell. And yet, something remarkable happened. Not only did Mongol DNA enter the population, it stayed. Modern Uzbek males, especially in the north and in Afghan Uzbek populations, show staggering frequencies of haplogroup C2, the so-called Genghisid marker. In some samples, over 40% of Uzbek men carry it. It's a genetic scar left by empire. But Mongol conquest wasn't only about destruction. It was a gateway. With the Mongols came the unification of Eurasia under the Pax Mongolica, and a reinvigoration of the Silk Road. And here, the Uzbek lands played their greatest role yet. The world has forgotten how powerful silence once was on the road from China to Rome. But in Uzbekistan, silence still clings to the stones, to the dust of Bokhara's caravanserais, to the worn tiles of Samarkand's madrasas. Here, in the very arteries of the Silk Road, the DNA of 1,000 strangers passed from hand to hand, silently, invisibly, generation after generation. What makes Uzbek DNA so extraordinary is not just who contributed to it, but how they met. The Silk Road was not a metaphor. It was an actual mechanism, one that moved genes across mountains, deserts, and languages. When a Chinese merchant married a Persian artisan, when an Indian pilgrim stayed to farm in the Zarafshan Valley, when a Khitan monk joined a caravan and never returned east, Their children became part of the Uzbek future, and the evidence still lives in the mitochondria. Modern studies of maternal lineages in Uzbekistan reveal something that geneticists almost never see: symmetry, a near-perfect balance between East Eurasian and West Eurasian haplogroups. Not in theory, in data. In the East, valleys like Fergana pulse with East Asian mitochondrial markers. In the West, Khwarezm and Bokhara speak the language of the Iranian plateau. And at the center, Tashkent, the genomes waver, balanced on a knife edge. This balance didn't happen by chance. It's the fingerprint of trade, of hospitality, of centuries of peace between invasions. Uzbekistan wasn't simply a transit zone. It was the place where the caravans stopped, where children were born of strangers, where lineages fused without war, where genes, unlike empires, endured. But what happens when we compare Uzbek DNA to their neighbors? Start with the Tajiks. They share geography, even marketplaces. But genetically, they drift west. Tajik genomes speak the language of ancient Iran. High R1A1, deep Indo-European roots, sparse Mongol echoes. Their DNA tells a tale of continuity, not collision. Then the Kazakhs, nomads of the north. Turkic in tongue and heart, their paternal lines burst with C2, O, N, the signatures of the East. In some clans, Mongol markers rise to near total dominance. Their heritage runs with the blood of horsemen and empire. But their connection to Iranian ancestry is thinner, more distant. Uzbeks stand between these worlds, not just geographically, but genetically. They are not halfway. They are both. Some Uzbek subgroups align with sedentary Tajiks, especially those from ancient cities, where Persian culture once ruled. Others cluster genetically with Kazakhs, especially among tribes with nomadic heritage. But no single group captures the full Uzbek picture. Even within families, one brother may carry the R1A1 of Indo-Iranian priests, another the C2 of a Mongol captain. This is not contradiction, it is origin. A people formed not by lineage, but by convergence. This is why scientists struggle to model Uzbek DNA with neat categories. Principal component analyses show Uzbeks scattered, not forming a tight cluster, but overlapping across the spectrum of Central Asia. One study called them a population of unions, another a genetic intersection. No wonder. They descend from Sarts and Chagatais, from traders and Khans, from women of the steppe and artisans of the Silk Road. They didn't form a single tribe, they inherited a map. And still, the map continues to shift. The borders of modern Uzbekistan are drawn with ink, but the boundaries of its ancestry are written in something far older: blood, language, and clan. What defines a people? For most nations, there's a shared myth, a singular root. But for the Uzbeks, there was no single beginning. There was only a convergence, an alliance of fragments. Even the term Uzbek once meant different things to different ears. To a nomad in the Kipchak steppe, it meant a horseback brotherhood, descendants of Genghis Khan's kin, hardened by the wind. To a Sart merchant in Samarkand, it meant the rulers who now governed his town, Turkic in name, Persian in soul. To a traveler crossing from Khwarezm to Kabul, it meant variety. It meant contradiction. And today, the DNA still shows it. Unlike other Central Asian groups, the Uzbek genome does not cluster tightly. Instead, it splinters, west to east, north to south. Geneticists tracking paternal lineages across Uzbekistan find that one valley may be dominated by haplogroup R1A1, a marker of ancient Indo-Iranian ancestry. Yet just a few hundred kilometers away, haplogroup C2, East Asian in origin, becomes dominant. This is not population drift. It is population design. The Uzbek identity emerged not from a tribe, but from the fusion of many: Turkic nomads, Persian townspeople, Mongol descendants, and the settled farmers of ancient Transoxiana. Each region absorbed a different ratio of past. In the Fergana Valley, once a corridor of movement, East Eurasian genetic influence runs deep, reflected in both paternal and maternal lines. In Kashkadaria or Khwarezm, the Western ancestry is stronger, with clear continuity to Iranian-speaking ancestors. Some lineages reflect deep Caucasus ancestry. Others carry markers rarely found outside of Siberia. This internal variation isn't just geographic, it's structural. Marriage practices, clan affiliation, and social status have all shaped gene flow. Nomadic clans often married within restricted patrilineal groups, compressing Y chromosome diversity. Settled communities practiced broader exogamy, increasing mitochondrial variation. The result is an asymmetry that echoes through generations. High maternal diversity, but distinct paternal bottlenecks. Some Uzbek families carry ancient haplotypes nearly extinct elsewhere. Others show rare combinations, only possible in regions where multiple migratory waves overlapped. In one sense, this fragmentation is a genetic puzzle, but in another, it's a living archive. No one Uzbek genome can tell the whole story, but together, the fragments do. They speak of a people not shaped by purity, but by plurality. Not isolated, but entangled. 1,000 pieces held together by history and language, not by homogeneity. When scientists compare genetic data from Uzbeks with that of Tajiks, Kazakhs, or Turkmens, the result is always the same. The Uzbeks sit in between, but never in one place. They shift. They scatter. They refuse to settle into one ancestral mold because they never had one to begin with. This is why attempts to define them genetically often end with more questions than answers. They are not a genetic midpoint. They are a layered history, and that history is still unfolding. Across the steppes and deserts of Central Asia, warriors came and went, empires rose and crumbled, but the chromosomes remained. When scientists peel back the layers of Uzbek DNA, they aren't just seeing ancestry. They're reading movements, patterns, events that happened centuries ago, still echoing in the living cells of the present. Let's begin with the male line. There is a thread, a marker called R1A1, a lineage born in the Bronze Age, riding westward with Indo-Iranian pastoralists. Among Uzbeks, it is not a trace. It is a backbone, not just because it's frequent, but because of where it comes from. This haplogroup passed through the hands of fire temple priests, through the veins of Scythian horsemen, through generations of settled Iranian farmers whose languages vanished, but whose blood did not. Yet R1A1 is only one pillar. Another emerges from the southwest, haplogroup J, a silent traveler from the Fertile Crescent. This lineage connects Uzbeks to the Middle East, to early agricultural societies, and perhaps to those who once carried the first crops across Iran into Central Asia. In some regions of Uzbekistan, it rises dramatically, forming a link between oasis culture and ancient Mesopotamian ancestry. Its presence suggests not just conquest, but shared lifeways, trade, and the quiet transmission of culture over centuries. But the eastern sky tells a different story. Here enters haplogroup C2, a genetic legacy of conquest and dust. It is the trace left behind by Turkic steppe nomads and Mongol expansion. Unlike R1A1 or J, this marker surges in specific populations, especially those tied to nomadic lineages. In the north, in Afghan Uzbek enclaves, it sometimes dominates. In others, it lingers. But its origin is unmistakable. Born in the east, carried west by hooves and banners. Other paternal lineages add their verses to this genetic poem. Haplogroup Q, tied to Siberian ancestry and even the early peoples of the Americas, runs deep among Turkmen tribes and is no stranger to Uzbek populations. It hints at connections more ancient, predating written memory, when Central Asia was not yet a crossroads, but a homeland. Then come the quieter signals, O, N, L, each modest in frequency, but rich in implication. These minor haplogroups, scattered like flecks of mineral and stone, suggest that not all migration came through war. Some came with craftsmen, exiles, and wandering monks. Yet if paternal lines trace the echo of fathers, mitochondrial DNA tells a different tale, the story of mothers, passed unbroken through daughters for thousands of years. And here, the complexity multiplies. Across Uzbekistan, maternal haplogroups form a spectrum so wide, so evenly balanced, that it defies simple narrative. Western markers like H, T, U, K speak of Neolithic farmers from Europe and the Near East. Eastern lineages, A, B, C, D, F, tie modern women to ancient clans in Siberia, Manchuria, and beyond. In cities like Tashkent, this balance hovers at equilibrium. But move eastward, and the Asian haplogroups swell. Move west, and European maternal ancestry gains strength. This gradient is not a relic of empire. It is the result of millennia of women crossing cultural boundaries, marrying into foreign tribes, and raising children in places far from where their ancestors were born. These maternal markers tell stories empires forget, of local brides and foreign soldiers, of captured artisans, of widows who stayed behind. Their DNA does not carry titles. It carries endurance. And in the aggregate, this uniparental data reveals something astonishing. The Uzbek genome is not merely diverse. It is layered with precision. Each marker, each haplogroup, is a timestamp, a fossil in motion, and when placed on the timeline of Central Asia's history, they align perfectly with the rise and fall of civilizations, the arrival of Indo-Iranians, the spread of agriculture, the waves of Turkic migrations, the Mongol storm, the Silk Road's quiet, persistent hum. The Uzbeks did not simply inherit genes. They inherited events. The soil of Uzbekistan remembers every empire that tried to claim it. Each left something behind. A temple, a ruin, a language. But deeper still, buried within the flesh of its people, are the remains of those who came, ruled, and vanished. Long before nation-states, this land was already occupied, not by borders, but by memory. The Achaemenids arrived first. Their banners stretched from Anatolia to the Oxus. They brought with them not just governance, but bloodlines from the Iranian plateau. Their administrators and soldiers settled along the rivers, married local women, and laid the genetic groundwork of West Eurasian ancestry that still persists today. Centuries later, the Sasanians reinforced that lineage. They fortified cities, built roads, and sent Zoroastrian clergy to distant provinces. Their cultural shadow was long, but their genetic influence was quiet, absorbed into the bloodstream of a people who would outlast them. But the true transformation began not with empire, but with movement. With the arrival of Turkic confederations in the early medieval period, the ethnic landscape began to shift. These were not invaders in the classical sense. They came in waves, sometimes as conquerors, other times as allies or vassals. Karluks, Oghuz, Yamas, each wave added a new chapter. Their impact wasn't just in the tongue now spoken by millions, but in the paternal DNA that spiked across Central Asia. Language was replaced, but genes were blended. Later came the storm that would burn itself into global memory, the Mongol conquest. When Genghis Khan's armies descended upon the region, they brought a force unlike anything Central Asia had seen. Cities were razed, dynasties overturned. But amid the destruction came permanent settlement. The Mongols did not simply pillage and retreat. They remained, intermarried, governed. Their bloodlines, marked in part by the expansion of haplogroup C2, became part of the local genome, especially among those descended from mobile clans and steppe aristocracies. The Timurids followed. Though founded by a man of Mongol descent, they Persianized their court, patronized Iranian scholars, and married into Sogdian and Sart nobility. This era saw less genetic upheaval, more cultural sedimentation. Yet even here, the mingling of elite lineages subtly altered the gene pool, introducing trace components from the Caucasus, Anatolia, and even South Asia, as artisans and captives flowed in with empire. But not all movement came through glory. The Russian imperial advance in the 19th century introduced Slavic populations and administrative castes. Some settled permanently, especially in the cities. Later, under Soviet rule, forced relocations brought Koreans from the east, Crimean Tatars from the west, and internal transfers of Central Asian groups into and out of Uzbekistan. These movements layered complexity onto the already intricate local genome, but they did so with new intent: surveillance, homogenization, control. Even then, the Uzbek genetic identity did not fracture. It absorbed, adapted, persisted. The intermingling was not always voluntary. Empires often used marriage, concubinage, or forced settlement as tools of assimilation. The children of these unions, often unrecorded in history, left indelible marks in mitochondrial diversity and unexpected haplogroup distributions. The result is not a singular ancestry, but a timeline written in biology. Each dynasty, each regime, each conqueror added something to the code, a thread of variation, a spike in regional frequencies, a subtle shift in phenotypic range. And while monuments collapsed and dialects faded, the genes endured. What makes the Uzbek genome so remarkable isn't just its diversity. It's the precision with which it mirrors the arc of history. Empires built their capitals in Samarkand and Bokhara. Today, their descendants walk the same streets, unaware that their cells still carry the imprint of rulers, exiles, warriors, and artisans long buried beneath them. The history of conquest did not overwrite identity. It inscribed it, molecule by molecule. It is easy to imagine the Silk Road as a line on a map, routes drawn between empires, caravans moving east to west. But that's not how it lived. It breathed. It pulsed through mountains, across rivers, and beneath the walls of cities that no longer exist. It was not one road, but many, woven together by the feet of travelers and the choices of strangers. And in the crossroads of these paths, something extraordinary happened. Genes moved, not in armies, in marriages. For over 1,000 years, Uzbekistan sat at the convergence of the world's longest-running biological experiment, an experiment with no plan, no oversight, and no clear result. Silk, spices, and scriptures passed through its markets, but so did lineages. Every caravan brought not just goods, but genetic possibilities. And those possibilities became people. When researchers examined the mitochondrial DNA of Uzbeks, they found something few populations exhibit: equilibrium. Not statistical noise, not anomaly, equilibrium. A nearly even distribution of maternal lineages from both East and West Eurasia, across multiple regions of the country. This was not the result of any one conquest or migration. It was the quiet legacy of sustained contact. A merchant from Chang'an might have stayed in Samarkand. A Persian calligrapher might have married a local woman in Bokhara. An Indian healer might have taken a Fergana bride. Their children didn't carry scrolls or contracts. They carried alleles. Over centuries, these moments accumulated, not in headlines, but in mitochondrial chains. Some lineages reveal origins as far-flung as the Caucasus Mountains or the Altai Range. Others trace to South Asian coasts, echoing ancient maritime trade that linked Gujarat to Central Asia. Even East Asian haplotypes normally confined to the Upper Amur are found in Uzbek maternal lines, evidence of distant travelers who stayed behind, or whose descendants retraced ancient roads in reverse. This is how the Silk Road changed human inheritance, not by building a new population, but by transforming an existing one into a vessel for global ancestry. And the signs are everywhere. In Tashkent, some lineages match those of Georgian Highlanders. In Khwarezm, sequences appear that are also found among Anatolian Turks. In eastern Uzbekistan, mitochondrial signatures common in Mongolic clans emerge beside South Asian maternal traces. Each strand is a path taken, a home chosen, a future reshaped. And it wasn't just maternal. Autosomal DNA tells the same story, an enduring admixture, deepened and refined over generations. Uzbek genomes are not erratic, they're continuous. They show persistent gene flow from both ends of Eurasia, beginning in the Iron Age and intensifying during the Silk Road's golden centuries. This constant infusion created what scientists call a Clinal pattern, a gradient of ancestry, rather than a set of discrete groups. Uzbeks exist along this gradient, not as a midpoint, but as a concentrated reflection of the entire corridor, a genetic summary of a continent's conversation with itself. The Silk Road didn't just link cities. It connected blood. The Uzbek genome is, in many ways, the most enduring monument of that connection. Long after caravan bells stopped ringing and desert sands buried the outposts, the evidence remained, encoded in the descendants of those who met in passing and never parted. This is the legacy no ruin can hold, a map not of roads, but of relationships. For centuries, the ancestors of Uzbekistan whispered their truths through monuments, languages, and epics. But much remained unsaid. Their faces vanished from memory. Their migrations faded from record, and their unions left no written trace. Until now, in sterile laboratories, under cold fluorescence, the secrets of these ancestors are being uncovered, not with parchment, but with base pairs. Uzbekistan has entered the genomic age. In 2025, a landmark initiative launched quietly but with historic implications, the Uzbek Genome Program. For the first time, the country began to map its people, not through censuses or family trees, but through full-sequence DNA, not just to catalog illness or risk, but to understand origin. And what emerged stunned even seasoned researchers. This was not a population with linear descent. It was a braided river of ancestry, flowing through thousands of years and hundreds of converging tributaries. Whole segments of the Uzbek genome defied classification. In many cases, they didn't resemble any known modern population. They were echoes of groups long extinct. Some matched ancient steppe nomads, populations like the Xiongnu or Wusun, long vanished from history. Others aligned with early Iranian cultivators from the Bactrian-Margiana region, whose civilizations crumbled before written Persian emerged. Still more showed affinity with early Chinese dynastic remains, suggesting deep-rooted links to the far eastern frontiers of prehistory. In essence, the genes had remembered what the maps had lost. Then came the ancient DNA sequencing. Skeletal remains from Iron Age burial mounds in southern Uzbekistan were sampled and sequenced, layer by layer. The result? Continuity. Individuals who lived over 2,500 years ago shared genomic structure with modern Uzbek populations. Not in passing, but in meaningful proportions. This was no accident. It meant that the upheavals of conquest, empire, and migration never fully replaced the region's base population. They built atop it, admixed, assimilated, but the root endured. Other studies explored the viral pandemics of the 21st century, analyzing not just viral mutations, but host genetics. Among Uzbek patients, unique variants emerged, nucleotide substitutions found at unusually high frequencies. Scientists studying these changes realized they pointed to a long history of adaptation, shaped by waves of interaction between East and West, pastoralist and urban, mountain and steppe. Meanwhile, agricultural genetics provided their own parallel. Studies on Uzbek wheat cultivars revealed hyperdiverse genetic signatures, an echo of the same evolutionary pressure that shaped the human population. Even plants told the same story: crossbreeding, hybrid vigor, and an ancient openness to genetic exchange. What makes all of this more than academic is the implication. The Uzbek genome is not a product of isolation, but of relentless convergence. A living palimpsest, not erased and rewritten, but layered over time. The more researchers look, the more complex it becomes. One scientist, after analyzing mitochondrial clines across the region, called it a map of all the roads we forgot to draw. Because in Uzbekistan, genetics is not just data. It's biography, of migration, of survival, of quiet, unrecorded union. As the Genome Project advances, so does a quiet realization that this land, so often overlooked in the great narratives of history, may hold one of the most complete stories of human movement on Earth. Genes don't only tell us where we come from, they shape how we endure. In Uzbekistan, the mosaic of ancestry has not only built a complex historical identity, it has sculpted bodies. Across millennia, this admixture created more than diversity. It forged adaptation. The first signs appear in the mirror. Uzbek phenotypes refuse categorization. In a single family, one child may carry the wide-set features of Siberian ancestors, another the aquiline nose of Persian forebears. Skin tones range from olive to fair, with eyes that hold the light of steppes, deserts, and mountain passes. This range is not randomness. It is the genetic memory of varied environments. Survival required flexibility. From the cold altitudes of the Tian Shan to the arid plains near the Aral Sea, generations of Uzbeks adapted to extremes. Over time, this left a signature in the very mechanisms of the immune system. Studies of the human leukocyte antigen, HLA, complex in Uzbek populations revealed a striking spectrum. Alleles common among both East Asian and West Eurasian populations, as well as variants rarely seen outside Central Asia itself. These antigens do more than identify cells. They determine resistance. Certain HLA profiles observed in Uzbek samples are linked to heightened immune response against viral pathogens, while others show susceptibility patterns unique to the region's historical exposures. One particular allele within the HLA-DRA gene has drawn attention for its correlation with higher HIV vulnerability, a reminder that genetic gifts often come with costs. Elsewhere in the genome, adaptation whispers more quietly. Variants affecting skin pigmentation suggest convergence from both ends of Eurasia. Traits inherited from Eastern Asian sources that adapted to lower UV levels, and from Iranian ancestors who evolved under more intense sun. Genes associated with fat metabolism and energy storage show signs of selection pressure consistent with nomadic heritage, designed to conserve energy during periods of scarcity. Even traits once seen as cosmetic hold deep utility. Facial morphology, broad cheekbones, flatter nasal bridges, deeper set eyes, have been linked to thermoregulatory efficiency in cold, dry air. These features, often dismissed as aesthetic variation, are in fact biological archives of climate adaptation. But some adaptations defy modern understanding. In a 2010 study analyzing over 1,500 mitochondrial genomes, researchers discovered fragmented haplotype networks, evidence of rapid expansion, contraction, and re-expansion. This pattern suggests that Central Asia, and Uzbekistan in particular, experienced not just one population bottleneck, but several. Each time, the survivors passed forward traits that favored resilience against disease, starvation, or environmental volatility. The real legacy of this adaptation, however, may lie in its ambiguity. Uzbeks are not defined by a single dominant trait. They are defined by plasticity. Their genome doesn't specialize, it absorbs. It doesn't fix, it flexes. This may be the most powerful inheritance of all, the ability to survive constant change without losing coherence. As genomic science advances, attention is now turning to functional genes, those that influence cognition, disease response, drug metabolism. Researchers are beginning to ask, do Uzbeks, because of their unique ancestral equilibrium, process medicine differently? Are there unknown protective factors embedded in their hybrid DNA? The answers may not just reshape national identity. They may alter medical protocols, treatment plans, even our definition of personalized health. Because what was once the legacy of empire, trade, and migration is now becoming a map for survival in the modern world. Not every story is told through language. Some are carried quietly, cell to cell, down an unbroken chain of human existence. They cross empires in silence, survive exile without memory, and pass through generations without a name. The Uzbek genome is one of these stories. To trace Uzbek ancestry is not to follow a straight path. It is to wander through ruins and marketplaces, through horse tracks and river valleys, through battles lost, cities reborn, and alliances that outlasted kingdoms. This isn't an identity forged in one place. It is the accumulation of 1,000 decisions, some made in love, others in violence, many in anonymity. And yet, the result is coherent. Not chaotic, coherent, because something held it all together. A child born today in Bokhara may carry the genes of an Iranian priestess, a Mongol commander, a Siberian herdsman, and a Sogdian scribe. Not metaphorically, literally. In his blood are the remains of worlds that no longer exist. But he does. He exists because those worlds met. In a time when identity is often narrowed to lines on a passport or boxes on a form, the Uzbek genome challenges us. It says, you can belong to many. You can descend from contradiction. You can be the product of collision and still be whole. This is not about nationalism. It is about memory. Geneticists working in Central Asia often describe Uzbeks as intermediate or admixed. But those are technical terms. The truth is deeper. Uzbeks are inheritors of movement, of plurality, of resilience. They are not merely the bridge between East and West. They are the record of how East and West were never truly separate to begin with, how every frontier is porous, how every migration leaves more behind than it takes. And in this way, Uzbek DNA is not just a subject of science. It's a mirror. It forces us to ask ourselves, who do we really come from? And more importantly, what did they survive so that we could stand here now? As we unlock more genomes, as the databases grow, the Uzbek genetic profile will remain one of the most important models we have. Not because it is exotic, but because it is honest. It tells the truth that history books often forget. that every lineage is shared, that every people is shaped by others, that our deepest inheritance is not purity, but connection. So the next time someone asks where the Uzbeks come from, the answer will not be a place. It will be a pattern, a crossroads, a legacy of being shaped and reshaped without ever being erased. And perhaps that is the most human story of all.